The cruelest kind of loneliness is discovering the world has already moved on without you. Rain hammered against the black iron gates of St. Bartholomew's Church as Evelyn Whitmore stood alone beneath the stone archway, her gloved hands trembling around the last wilted white rose from her father's funeral. The guests had long since disappeared into warm carriages and glowing homes, while she remained motionless beneath the storm-dark sky, as though her body had forgotten how to leave after losing everything worth returning to. Water dripped from the edge of her veil onto the marble steps below. Cold, steady, merciless. Somewhere behind the heavy church doors, laughter echoed faintly through the corridors where her cousins now discussed the division of the Whitmore estate, as if her father's memory were nothing more than another possession to be catalogued and sold. Evelyn lowered her gaze. 26 years old, and she had become invisible before the earth had even settled over her father's grave. Miss Whitmore. The sharp voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned slowly to find Mr. Hargrove, her family's attorney, standing beneath a black umbrella with visible discomfort tightening his narrow features. Even through the rain, she could see the pity in his eyes. That was somehow worse than cruelty. "I'm afraid there are documents requiring your signature before evening," he said carefully. "The creditors intend to proceed immediately." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment before answering. "Of course they do." Her voice remained soft, almost emotionless, though her chest felt hollow enough to collapse inward. The attorney hesitated. "There is also the matter of the engagement." At that, something inside her finally flinched. Not visibly, never visibly, but pain moved quietly through her like a crack spreading beneath frozen water. Theodore Ashcombe, the man who had once kissed her hand beneath chandeliers and promised her a future filled with music, children, and summers by the coast. 3 days earlier, his mother had sent a letter ending the engagement with elegant cruelty disguised as sympathy. "Your unfortunate circumstances make the union impossible." Evelyn had read the words only once before placing the letter into the fire. "You needn't explain further," she whispered. Thunder rolled across the hills beyond the churchyard as another carriage passed through the rain without slowing. Inside sat women wrapped in velvet and pearls who once greeted Evelyn warmly at society dinners. Tonight, none of them looked in her direction. A burden wearing silk. She had overheard the phrase earlier beside the cemetery gates. Strange how humiliation no longer shocked her. It merely exhausted her. Mr. Hargrove cleared his throat awkwardly. "There is one final matter. Whitmore House must be vacated within 48 hours. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. 48 hours. The home where her mother had played piano beside candlelight. The library where her father once carried her asleep after winter storms. Soon strangers would walk those halls while every trace of her family vanished into dust and auction books." "I understand," she said quietly. Then she stepped away from the church without waiting for assistance, pulling her thin black coat tighter against the freezing rain. Her boots slipped slightly on the wet cobblestones, but she never slowed. Across the street, hidden behind the fogged window of a dark carriage, Duke Lucian Ravenscroft watched her disappear into the storm. He had attended the funeral out of obligation, intending to leave unnoticed the moment it ended. Yet something about the sight of Evelyn Whitmore walking alone through the rain with grief carried so silently upon her shoulders had rooted him motionless inside the shadows of his carriage. Most people cried when their lives shattered. Most people begged. She did neither. And for reasons Lucian could not yet explain, the quiet dignity in her suffering unsettled him far more than despair ever could. By the following morning, Whitmore House no longer felt like a home. It felt like a body waiting to be buried. The once grand estate stood beneath a gray October sky, its tall windows dim behind curtains that had not been opened since her father's death. Dust lingered in the silent corridors where laughter had once drifted beside candlelight and piano. Music. Evelyn moved through the manor slowly, her black dress brushing against polished wooden floors as servants carried furniture from room to room under the cold supervision of estate officials. No one spoke above a whisper anymore. Not out of respect, out of discomfort. Misfortune made people quiet, especially when they feared it might become contagious. "Careful with that vase," one of the maids murmured nervously as two men carried away a porcelain urn from the drawing room. "It belonged to Lady Whitmore." "Not anymore," another replied flatly. Evelyn paused outside the doorway, her fingers tightening around the small leather journal pressed against her chest. Her mother's journal. The only thing she had kept hidden before the creditors arrived. She should have felt anger watching strangers dismantle the remains of her family piece by piece. Instead, exhaustion settled over her like winter fog. Deep, heavy, endless. She continued toward the library at the end of the hall, where weak afternoon light spilled across towering shelves lined with books soon to be sold to collectors who would never understand the hands that once turned their pages. The scent of old paper and cedar lingered faintly in the air. Her father's favorite chair remained beside the fireplace exactly as he had left it. For one dangerous moment, Evelyn almost imagined she might still hear his voice. "You always carry sorrow too quietly, little dove." Her throat tightened instantly. She lowered herself slowly into the chair beside his, staring into the cold fireplace, while rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The silence hurt more than grief itself. A sudden knock shattered the moment. Evelyn looked up as Mrs. Porter, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Whitmore family for nearly 30 years, stepped into the library with red eyes and trembling hands. "Miss Evelyn," she whispered, "there is someone here to see you." Evelyn frowned slightly. "Who?" Before the housekeeper could answer, another voice spoke from the doorway. "I apologize for the intrusion." Deep, controlled, unfamiliar. Evelyn stood immediately. Duke Lucian Ravenscroft entered the library with the quiet authority of a man long accustomed to commanding every room without effort. Tall and broad-shouldered beneath a dark charcoal coat still damp from rain, he carried no expression beyond polite restraint. Yet there was something severe in the stillness of him, something distant. His silver-gray eyes swept briefly across the room before settling on Evelyn herself. "Your Grace," she said softly, startled enough to forget her exhaustion for half a heartbeat. She had seen him only from afar at social gatherings over the years. Always alone, always cold. Rumors followed him through every ballroom in London. The widowed duke who no longer smiled. The man who shut half his estate after his wife's death and rarely allowed guests beyond his gates. Seeing him here inside the ruins of her family home felt strangely unreal. Lucian inclined his head once. "Forgive me for arriving unannounced. I wish to offer my condolences personally." Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly. "That is kind of you." "No," he replied after a pause. "Kindness would have arrived sooner." The words caught her off guard. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Rainwater glimmered faintly against the shoulders of his coat, while shadows from the fireless hearth carved sharp lines across his tired face. He looked less like a duke and more like a man who had forgotten what rest felt like years ago. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Somewhere upstairs, another piece of furniture scraped across the floor as it was carried away forever. Lucian's eyes lifted toward the sound. "They are taking everything?" he asked quietly. Evelyn forced herself to answer calmly. "Everything except what grief already claimed first." Something flickered in his expression then. Brief, almost invisible. Not pity, recognition. And somehow that frightened her far more. The rain had stopped by evening, but Whitmore House remained wrapped in the kind of silence that follows ruin too closely. Candlelight flickered weakly against the library walls while servants moved like ghosts through distant corridors carrying away the final remains of a family that had once filled the estate with music and conversation. Evelyn stood beside the tall window overlooking the dark gardens, her hands folded tightly before her as cold glass pressed against her fingertips. Behind her, Duke Lucian Ravenscroft remained near the fireplace, motionless except for the occasional shift of shadows across his face. Neither of them seemed eager to disturb the strange stillness that had settled between them. "Most people would have left by now," Evelyn said quietly after several moments. Lucian's gaze lifted toward her reflection in the window. "Most people prefer comfort over honesty." She looked down faintly. "And what do you prefer, Your Grace?" The Duke did not answer immediately. Outside, wind stirred through the dead autumn branches while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. Finally he spoke. Silence. The word lingered heavily between them. Evelyn understood it more than she wished to admit. Since her father's death, silence had become the loudest thing in her world. The silence at the dinner table. The silence after cruel whispers stopped when she entered a room. The silence left behind when someone realized she no longer possessed wealth worth impressing. Lucian stepped slowly toward the bookshelf nearest the fire, running one gloved finger along the spine of an old leather volume. "Your father was respected," he said. "Not many men leave behind loyalty after death." Evelyn managed a faint smile that vanished almost immediately. Respect disappears quickly when creditors arrive. Something unreadable crossed Lucian's expression then. He knew that tone, the exhaustion hidden beneath composure, the dangerous kind of grief that no longer fought to survive because it had already accepted defeat quietly. His late wife had worn the same expression during her final winter. The memory tightened unexpectedly in his chest. He turned away from it at once. "Where will you go?" he asked. Evelyn stared into the darkness outside the window. "I have not decided." "You have nowhere." The bluntness should have sounded cruel, yet his voice carried no judgment. Only fact. Evelyn lowered her eyes. No, the confession seemed to alter the room itself. The fire crackled softly while shadows trembled across the walls, lined with books soon to belong to strangers. Lucian studied her carefully then. Her black dress was simple compared to the elegant society once associated with the Whitmore name. Yet she still carried herself with quiet dignity despite the humiliation swallowing her life piece by piece. No tears, no bitterness, only exhaustion carefully hidden beneath grace. Most people collapsed when stripped of comfort. Evelyn Whitmore merely grew quieter, and somehow that unsettled him more than desperation ever could. A knock interrupted the silence before either could speak again. Mrs. Porter entered hesitantly, carrying a silver tray with untouched tea growing cold beside delicate porcelain cups. "Your Grace," she murmured nervously. "The carriage is prepared whenever you wish to depart." Lucian glanced toward the old housekeeper, then back at Evelyn standing alone beside the darkened window. Something inside him resisted the idea of leaving her there among the remains of a dying life. Irrational, unwelcome, dangerous. He had spent 5 years avoiding attachment strong enough to wound him again. Yet the thought of Whitmore House empty tomorrow while Evelyn vanished into a world already eager to forget her stirred a restlessness he could not explain. Mrs. Porter shifted awkwardly. "Miss Evelyn has received another letter this evening," she added quietly. "From the Ashcombe family." At the mention of Theodore Ashcombe, Evelyn's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the fabric of her sleeves. Lucian noticed instantly. "I have not read it," she said softly. "I doubt there is anything left worth saying." Lucian's jaw hardened slightly, though his expression remained calm. Men who abandoned loyalty when fortune disappeared disgusted him more than he cared to admit. He moved toward the doorway slowly before pausing beside her, close enough now that Evelyn caught the faint scent of rain and cedar lingering against his coat. "Do not read it tonight," he said quietly. She looked up at him in surprise. For the first time since entering the library, Lucian's voice carried something almost human beneath its cold restraint. "Some wounds," he murmured, "do not deserve another." Knife. The last night inside Whitmore House arrived colder than the others. Wind pressed softly against the tall windows while weak candlelight trembled through rooms already stripped of paintings, silver, and furniture that had belonged to generations now reduced to names on legal documents. Evelyn sat alone on the floor of her bedroom beside 2 small traveling cases containing everything left of her life. A few dresses, her mother's journal, a silver hairbrush worn smooth with age. Nothing more. The emptiness surrounding her no longer felt shocking, only final. She stared at the dying fire in the hearth while shadows climbed slowly along the pale walls. Somewhere downstairs, footsteps echoed as servants finished packing the remaining household items for auction at dawn. Most of them had cried when saying goodbye to her earlier that evening. Evelyn had not. Grief exhausted itself eventually. After enough loss, even sorrow became too heavy to carry loudly. A soft knock sounded at the door. Before she could answer, Mrs. Porter stepped quietly inside, holding a sealed envelope. "This arrived an hour ago, Miss Evelyn." Evelyn recognized the dark wax crest immediately. "Ravenscroft." Her pulse faltered faintly. "Thank you." The housekeeper lingered near the doorway with unusual hesitation. "I know it is not my place," the older woman said softly, "but I believe His Grace sees more than he allows others to notice." Evelyn lowered her eyes to the envelope in her hands. "That may be precisely why he should stay away from me." Mrs. Porter's expression saddened. "Broken things are not always burdens, my dear." After the door closed once more, silence returned heavily around the room. Evelyn stared at the letter for several moments before finally breaking the seal. The handwriting inside was sharp and restrained, much like the man himself. Miss Whitmore, my aunt, Lady Agnes Ravenscroft, is in need of a companion during the winter season at Greyhaven Manor. Mrs. Ashford, her previous attendant, departed unexpectedly last month due to illness within her family. The position would provide private accommodations and salary sufficient for independence should you wish to accept. Transportation may be arranged tomorrow morning. Lucian Ravenscroft. Evelyn read the letter twice beneath the flickering candlelight. No unnecessary sympathy. No false kindness. Merely an offer presented with dignity intact. Somehow that affected her more deeply than comfort would have. Most people pitted fallen women from a safe distance. The Duke had offered her purpose instead. Yet uncertainty tightened quietly in her chest. Greyhaven Manor, the isolated northern estate whispered about throughout society for years. A house wrapped in mourning where candlelit corridors remained empty after sunset, and the widowed Duke rarely entertained guests. Some claimed he still wandered the halls at night, unable to sleep beside memories of his late wife. Others insisted grief had turned his heart permanently cold. Evelyn folded the letter carefully against her lap. She should refuse. Pride alone demanded it. Accepting charity from a man she barely knew felt dangerously close to surrender. But another truth lingered beneath her fear. By tomorrow evening, she would have nowhere left to go. Wind rattled faintly against the windows again as the fire dimmed lower. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, remembering Lucian standing beside the library doorway earlier that day with rain still clinging to his coat, while he told her not to reopen wounds that deserved to remain closed. No one had spoken to her with such quiet understanding in a very long time. Most people offered advice. He offered shelter without humiliation. Her fingers tightened slowly around the letter. Somewhere deep beneath exhaustion, something fragile stirred for the first time since her father's death. Not hope. She no longer trusted hope enough for that. But perhaps the faint possibility of surviving this winter without disappearing completely. The thought frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. Outside, midnight bells echoed softly through the sleeping town, while snow began falling across the darkened gardens of Whitmore House. And miles away beyond the frozen hills, Duke Lucian Ravenscroft stood alone beside the window of Greyhaven Manor's library, staring into the storm with the uneasy realization that, for the first time in 5 years, he found himself waiting for someone to arrive. Snow covered the northern roads by the time Evelyn Whitmore's carriage reached Greyhaven Manor 3 days later. The journey had lasted nearly 14 hours through frozen countryside, where bare trees stretched like dark skeletal hands against the white horizon. Inside the carriage, cold pressed through the windows despite the heavy wool blanket folded across her lap. Evelyn stared silently at the storm beyond the glass, while the final image of Whitmore House lingered painfully in her mind. She had not looked back when leaving. Some goodbyes became unbearable the moment they were acknowledged. As dusk settled over the hills, the outline of Greyhaven Manor finally emerged through falling snow. Vast, silent, ancient, the enormous stone estate stood atop a ridge overlooking miles of frozen forest, its towering windows glowing faintly beneath the dark winter sky. Candlelight flickered behind the glass like distant stars trapped inside a tomb. Evelyn felt her breath catch softly at the sight of it. The manor did not resemble a home. It resembled memory itself, cold and beautiful and impossible to escape. The carriage rolled slowly beneath the iron gates before stopping at the grand entrance where 2 lanterns swayed against the wind. A butler descended the steps immediately, his dark coat dusted with snow. "Miss Whitmore," he greeted with a respectful bow. "Welcome to Greyhaven Manor. I am Mr. Holloway." Evelyn stepped carefully onto the icy stone, tightening her gloves against the bitter air. "Thank you." Before she could say more, the massive front doors opened behind the butler. Warmth spilled outward along with the soft glow of chandeliers and firelight. Yet, even inside, the manor carried an unmistakable stillness. Portraits lined the marble walls beneath black drapery, while long corridors vanished into shadows beyond the entrance hall. Somewhere in the distance, an old clock echoed softly through the house. Tick, tick, tick. The sound reminded Evelyn strangely of breathing inside a cathedral. Lady Agnes retired early this evening, Mr. Holloway explained while servants quietly carried her luggage upstairs. You shall meet her tomorrow morning. Evelyn nodded faintly, though her attention drifted toward the far end of the hall, where a large portrait hung partially veiled in black silk. Even from a distance, she could make out the image of a beautiful woman with dark hair and gentle eyes. The late Duchess. A chill passed quietly through her. His Grace is in the library, the butler added carefully. He requested to be informed once you arrived safely. Before Evelyn could respond, another sound reached her from somewhere deeper within the manor. Piano music. Soft, slow, hauntingly beautiful. Every servant in the entrance hall seemed to still for half a heartbeat. Mr. Holloway lowered his voice instinctively. The Duke has not touched the piano in years. Evelyn looked toward the distant corridor where the melody drifted through shadows lit only by candlelight. There was grief inside the music. Not dramatic grief. Not loud. The kind that settled into a person so deeply it became part of their breathing. Without realizing it, Evelyn found herself moving quietly toward the sound. Past towering windows streaked with snow. Past flickering candles trembling against stone walls. The music grew clearer as she approached the library doorway, left slightly open at the end of the corridor. Inside, Duke Lucian Ravenscroft sat alone before a black grand piano beside the fire. His broad shoulders remained rigid beneath a dark waistcoat, while silver firelight flickered across one side of his face. He did not notice her at first. His hands moved slowly across the keys with careful restraint, as though touching something fragile enough to break. Evelyn stood motionless in the doorway. She had never seen grief look so lonely. Then suddenly the music stopped. Lucian lifted his head sharply toward the entrance, his gray eyes finding hers instantly through the dim candlelight. Silence flooded the room once more. Neither moved. Snow rattled faintly against the tall library windows, while fire crackled softly between them. For one strange, suspended moment, Evelyn felt as though she had walked into something deeply private that words could only ruin. Lucian rose, slowly from the piano bench. You should be resting after such a long journey, he said quietly. His voice carried the same calm restraint as before, yet something guarded had returned to his expression now that he was no longer alone. Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly. I apologize. I did not mean to intrude. Most people avoid this room entirely. She looked back at him then. Perhaps most people are afraid of silence. A faint shadow crossed Lucian's face at her words. Not anger. Something far more dangerous. Recognition. The first morning at Greyhaven Manor arrived beneath a sky the color of ash. Snow drifted endlessly beyond the tall bedroom windows, while pale winter light stretched weakly across the unfamiliar room where Evelyn Whitmore woke after a restless night filled with strange dreams and distant piano music that seemed to linger even after silence returned. For several moments, she remained still beneath the heavy quilt, listening to the quiet breathing of the manor itself. The old house creaked softly against the wind as though carrying memories too heavy for stone walls alone. Somewhere far below, a clock chimed 8 slow times. Evelyn sat up carefully, brushing loose strands of chestnut hair from her face while cold air brushed against her skin. The room prepared for her was elegant but restrained. No unnecessary luxury. A small fireplace glowed softly near the window while dark wooden furniture stood polished beneath candlelight, left burning through the night. Everything about Greyhaven felt controlled, disciplined, as though grief itself had arranged the house and forbidden anything too warm from surviving inside it. By the time Evelyn descended the grand staircase an hour later, the manor remained unusually silent. Servants moved quietly through corridors lined with towering portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her beneath flickering wall sconces. Mr. Holloway appeared near the dining room entrance with his usual composed expression. Lady Agnes is taking breakfast in her chambers this morning, Miss Whitmore, he explained softly. Her health weakened during the storm last evening. Evelyn nodded immediately. May I see her? Grace instructed the same. The butler hesitated briefly before adding, Lady Agnes has not accepted many companions since the Duchess passed. Something in his tone suggested caution rather than simple information. Evelyn followed him upstairs through long corridors draped in silence until they reached the eastern wing, where sunlight barely touched the tall windows overlooking frozen gardens below. At the end of the hall, Mr. Holloway opened a carved oak door quietly. "Lady Agnes," he announced gently, "Miss Whitmore has arrived." The elderly woman seated near the fireplace looked up slowly from beneath a thick wool blanket wrapped across her lap. Age had softened her features, but not diminished the sharp intelligence in her pale blue eyes. Silver hair framed her face neatly, while several unopened letters rested untouched beside her teacup. "Come closer, child," she said warmly. Evelyn stepped inside with a respectful smile. "Good morning, my lady." Lady Agnes studied her for several silent seconds before nodding faintly. "You look exactly as sorrow should not." The unexpected statement caught Evelyn off guard. "I beg your pardon." "Too young," the older woman murmured quietly, "and far too tired behind the eyes." Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly, unsure how to answer honestly without revealing more pain than dignity allowed. But Lady Agnes merely patted the chair beside her. "Sit with me." The hours that followed passed more gently than Evelyn expected. She read aloud while snow fell outside the windows and occasionally listened as Lady Agnes spoke about books, music, and winters long before Greyhaven became wrapped in mourning. Yet even during lighter moments, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Every conversation inside this house eventually circled back toward absence. The late Duchess. The silence after her death. The man downstairs who had never truly returned from losing her. By evening, Lady Agnes had fallen asleep beside the fire while Evelyn quietly adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. As she turned toward the doorway, movement outside the room caught her attention. Duke Lucian Ravenscroft stood at the far end of the corridor partially hidden within shadow, one hand resting against the dark wooden railing overlooking the staircase below. He must have been there longer than she realized. Their eyes met across the candlelit hall. "You stayed with her all day," he said quietly. Evelyn stepped into the corridor, carefully closing the bedroom door behind her. She should not have been alone. Lucian's gaze lingered on her face for a moment before drifting briefly toward the closed door. "Most companions last less than a month here." "Why?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Because grief exhausts people who have never carried it themselves." The words settled heavily between them while snow brushed softly against the windows nearby. Evelyn looked at him carefully then. Candlelight flickered across his sharp features while exhaustion lingered beneath his calm expression like a shadow that never fully disappeared. For the first time, she noticed how tired he truly seemed. Not physically, spiritually, as though part of him had remained trapped beside a grave years ago and never found the strength to leave. Lucian broke the silence first. "My aunt smiled today." Evelyn blinked softly. "That does not seem unusual." "It is here." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Nothing smiles at Greyhaven anymore." Something fragile passed through the stillness between them then. Invisible, quiet, dangerous. And for reasons neither fully understood, neither of them walked away. Winter settled heavily over Greyhaven Manor during the weeks that followed. Snow buried the gardens beneath endless white while cold winds moved through the ancient trees surrounding the estate like whispers too old to disappear. Yet despite the harsh season, something inside the manor had begun to change quietly. Servants lingered longer in conversation. Fires were lit earlier in the evenings. Even Lady Agnes laughed occasionally now while Evelyn read beside the hearth during long afternoons wrapped in candlelight and falling snow. No one spoke openly about the shift, but everyone felt it, especially Lucian Ravenscroft. He noticed it in the smallest moments. The sound of piano music drifting softly from the drawing room one evening. After years of silence. The way his aunt's hands no longer trembled quite as violently during breakfast conversations. The strange warmth waiting in the library now whenever Evelyn sat reading near the fire with loose strands of chestnut hair glowing softly beneath candlelight. Greyhaven no longer felt entirely abandoned by life, and that unsettled him more than he wished to admit. One particular evening, a formal winter gathering was held at Blackthorn Hall several miles south of the estate. Lady Agnes insisted upon attending despite the weather, claiming she refused to spend another season hidden away like a forgotten ghost. Lucian reluctantly agreed only after her physician approved the short journey. Evelyn had intended to remain at Greyhaven during the event. She possessed no proper gowns beyond mourning attire and even less desire to face society after everything that had happened in London. But Lady Agnes dismissed every protest immediately. "You have spent enough time apologizing for surviving difficult things," the older woman declared firmly while adjusting a sapphire brooch at her throat. "You are coming." 2 hours later, Evelyn stood near the ballroom entrance feeling painfully out of place beneath glittering chandeliers and gold-trimmed ceilings crowded with aristocrats draped in silk and diamonds. Music echoed through the enormous hall, while servants carried crystal glasses between laughing groups who seemed untouched by grief or hardship. Conversations softened noticeably as Evelyn entered beside Lady Agnes. She recognized the looks instantly. Curiosity, judgment, pity carefully disguised as politeness. "That is Evelyn Whitmore. I heard the creditors took everything. Did not her fiancé abandon her after the funeral? And now she lives at Greyhaven?" The whispers moved through the ballroom like smoke. Evelyn kept her posture composed despite the humiliation tightening quietly in her chest. Beside her, Lady Agnes squeezed her gloved hand gently. "Lift your chin, child. People who gossip usually possess very little worth saying aloud." Evelyn managed the faintest smile. Yet across the ballroom, near the grand staircase, another voice rose more sharply than the others. "Some women truly have remarkable survival instincts." Lady Beatrice Hollowmere stood surrounded by elegantly dressed companions, her jeweled fan resting lazily against one wrist while amusement flickered across her painted smile. First an engagement to Theodore Ashcombe, then residence inside Greyhaven Manor itself. Her gaze slid slowly over Evelyn. "Tragic beauty does appear profitable this season." Several nearby guests laughed softly behind raised glasses. Evelyn felt heat rise painfully beneath her skin, though her expression remained calm. She had endured cruelty before, but humiliation in crowded rooms carried a different kind of loneliness. Before she could respond, movement stirred near the ballroom entrance behind her. The laughter stopped almost instantly. Duke Lucian Ravenscroft crossed the marble floor with slow, deliberate steps, dressed entirely in black except for silver cufflinks catching the candlelight. Conversations faded as he approached. His expression remained unreadable, yet something dangerous settled into the silence surrounding him now. Lady Beatrice's smile faltered slightly. "Your Grace," she greeted quickly. Lucian stopped beside Evelyn without taking his eyes from Lady Beatrice. "You appear unusually interested in Miss Whitmore this evening." The woman laughed nervously. "Merely conversation. Conversation generally requires intelligence from both participants." The ballroom fell completely silent. Evelyn's breath caught softly as Lucian finally turned toward her. For one suspended moment, the noise, music, and whispers around them seemed to disappear entirely. His gray eyes lowered briefly to her trembling hand still resting at her side before returning to her face. "If Miss Whitmore leaves this ballroom," he said quietly enough that everyone still heard every word, "I shall leave with her." No one spoke after that, because suddenly the ruined woman's society pitted no longer stood alone. And somehow that changed everything. The storm began shortly after midnight. Wind slammed against Greyhaven Manor with such force that the old windows trembled inside their frames, while snow swallowed the northern hills. Beyond the estate, most of the household had long since retired after returning from Blackthorn Hall, but Evelyn remained awake beside the small fire in her room, unable to quiet the memory of Lucian standing beside her in the ballroom, while an entire room fell silent around them. No one had defended her like that before. Not her former friends. Not Theodore. Not even herself. Yet somehow the Duke had spoken only one sentence and made her feel less alone than she had in months. The thought unsettled her deeply. A sudden crack of thunder echoed through the manor, followed instantly by darkness. The firelight vanished. The hallway lamps extinguished one by one beyond her door until Greyhaven stood consumed entirely by shadow. Evelyn rose immediately, wrapping a wool shawl around her shoulders before reaching for the candle resting beside her bed. Outside, snow battered the windows violently, while distant footsteps moved through the corridors below as servants attempted to relight lanterns against the storm. Holding the small candle carefully before her, Evelyn stepped into the hall. Cold air drifted through the darkened manor, while shadows stretched endlessly across stone floors and towering portraits draped in black silk. Somewhere downstairs, a door slammed heavily against the wind. She moved quietly toward Lady Agnes's room first, relieved to find the older woman sleeping peacefully despite the storm. Yet as Evelyn turned back toward the staircase, another sound reached her through the darkness. Piano music. Soft, uneven, almost broken. Her breath caught faintly. The melody drifted from somewhere below like a ghost wandering through the house. Without fully understanding why, Evelyn followed it. Down the grand staircase, through silent corridors lit only by the trembling flame in her hand. The music led her toward the old music room at the western end of the manor, a part of Greyhaven rarely entered since the Duchess's death. The door stood partially open. Evelyn hesitated briefly before stepping inside. Candlelight flickered weakly across the enormous room where rain lashed against tall windows overlooking the frozen cliffs beyond the estate. Dust-covered, most of the furniture beneath white cloths, while a grand piano stood alone near the fireplace. Lucien sat before it with his back partially turned toward her, one hand resting motionless against the keys while the other gripped a crystal glass untouched beside him. He looked exhausted. Not like a duke. Not even entirely like himself. Merely a man carrying grief too heavy for silence anymore. He noticed her reflection in the dark window almost immediately. "You should not be wandering Greyhaven alone during storms," he said quietly without looking up. Evelyn stepped farther inside, closing the door softly behind her. "Neither should you." A faint shadow crossed his face at that. Thunder rolled again outside while firelight flickered weakly across the sharp lines of his profile. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Lucien finally exhaled slowly and lowered his gaze toward the piano keys beneath his hand. "This was her room," he murmured. Evelyn understood instantly who he meant. The Duchess. She played every evening after dinner. Lucien continued quietly. Even during winter storms. His voice remained calm, but something fragile lived beneath the restraint now. The house sounded alive then. Evelyn moved closer slowly, stopping near the fireplace while snow rattled against the windows beside them. "What was her name?" she asked softly. Lucien's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Catherine." The name lingered heavily in the room. Loved deeply enough to survive death itself. Lucien stared down at his hand resting against the piano before speaking again. "She died 5 years ago during childbirth." Evelyn's breath caught softly. "I am sorry." He laughed once under his breath without humor. "Everyone says that, because they do not know what else to say." That finally made him look at her. Candlelight trembled across his gray eyes while exhaustion and grief stripped away the cold distance he wore before the world. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What would you say?" Evelyn held his gaze for several silent seconds. "I think," she whispered gently, "some losses remain inside us because love had nowhere else to go." Silence followed, deep and aching and impossibly intimate. Lucien stared at her as though she had spoken aloud something he had spent years trying not to feel. Then slowly, almost without realizing it, his hand began to tremble against the piano keys. Evelyn noticed immediately. So did he. Embarrassment flickered sharply across his face as he pulled his hand away. But before he could retreat behind distance again, Evelyn stepped forward carefully and placed the candle beside the piano. "You do not have to hide grief from me," she said softly. The storm raged outside Greyhaven Manor while silence settled between them once more. Yet for the first time in years, Lucien Ravenscroft no longer felt entirely alone inside it. After the storm, Greyhaven Manor seemed quieter than before, as though the house itself had overheard something too intimate to disturb. Snow remained piled against the windows while pale winter sunlight struggled through heavy clouds hanging low above the cliffs. Yet despite the stillness, Evelyn could not stop thinking about the look in Lucien Ravenscroft's eyes the night before inside the music room. It had not been the cold distance society feared. It had been sorrow stripped entirely bare. And somehow that haunted her more deeply than cruelty ever could. The following days passed beneath an unspoken tension neither of them acknowledged aloud. Lucien remained polite, controlled, careful with every word spoken during meals or evening conversations beside the library fire. Yet Evelyn noticed the subtle changes impossible to hide completely. He lingered longer now when entering a room she occupied, asked whether she had eaten after long afternoons spent caring for Lady Agnes. Once, during a particularly cold evening, she discovered fresh logs already placed beside the fireplace in her chambers before she returned upstairs. No servant claimed responsibility. Neither did he. But she knew, and somehow the quietness of his care affected her more than grand gestures ever could. One night, nearly 2 weeks after the storm, Evelyn woke suddenly to the sound of something shattering downstairs. She sat upright immediately, heart racing beneath the darkness while wind rattled faintly against the windows beside her bed. For several seconds, silence returned. Then footsteps echoed heavily somewhere below, followed by a low, strained breath unlike anything she had heard before. Fear tightened quietly in her chest. Throwing a wool robe over her nightdress, Evelyn grabbed a candle and stepped into the corridor. Greyhaven slept beneath shadows and weak moonlight filtering through tall windows glazed with frost. The air felt colder than usual as she moved carefully toward the staircase, listening. Another sound reached her then. A sharp inhale. Uneven. Almost panicked. It came from the library. Evelyn hurried faster. The library doors stood partially open, firelight flickering weakly across the dark hallway beyond. She pushed the door gently inward and froze. Lucien stood near the fireplace with one hand braced heavily against the mantel while the other pressed tightly against his chest as though trying to steady his breathing. Several books lay scattered across the floor beside a shattered crystal glass. His face had gone pale beneath the firelight, silver gray, eyes unfocused with something far more dangerous than anger. Fear. Real fear. He looked toward her sharply at the sound of the door. Leave. The word came rougher than usual. Evelyn did not move. Lucien. Do not. His breathing faltered again. Not now. But she crossed the room anyway. Slowly. Carefully. Like approaching a wounded animal already expecting abandonment. You are shaking, she whispered. It will pass. Yet his voice betrayed him instantly. Evelyn stopped only inches away now, close enough to see exhaustion carved deeply into the sharp lines of his face. Close enough to notice how tightly he clenched his jaw against whatever invisible memory hunted him through the darkness. Nightmare? She asked gently. Lucien looked away at once. Silence answered her instead. Then quietly, almost ashamed, he nodded once. Evelyn's chest tightened painfully. She understood nightmares too well. The kind that woke a person breathless and disoriented long after grief should have softened. For several moments neither spoke, while fire crackled softly behind them. Then suddenly Lucien laughed under his breath. Without humor. Ridiculous, is it not? His eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. 5 years later, and I still wake believing I failed her all over again. Evelyn stared at him quietly. You loved her. I buried her. The words broke more sharply than he intended. Regret flashed instantly across his face as though he hated himself for speaking honestly at all. But before he could retreat behind coldness again, Evelyn reached forward carefully and placed her hand over his trembling one resting against the mantel. Lucien froze immediately beneath her touch. The entire room seemed to still around them. Firelight flickered softly across the library walls while snow drifted soundlessly beyond the windows. Evelyn's voice lowered almost to a whisper. Grief is not punishment for failing someone, she said gently. It is proof they mattered enough to leave part of themselves behind. Lucien stared down at her hand covering his. Warm, steady, real. No one had touched him during one of these nights since Catherine died. Most people feared grief once they witnessed its true shape. Evelyn did not pull away, and somehow that nearly destroyed what remained of the walls around his heart. Slowly, almost unconsciously, his fingers closed slightly beneath hers. Not possessive, not demanding, merely human. For the first time in years, the Duke of Greyhaven realized the silence inside his life no longer felt empty when Evelyn Whitmore stood within it. By February, whispers about Greyhaven Manor had spread far beyond the northern countryside. Society always noticed when a powerful man changed his habits. And Lucien Ravenscroft had changed in ways impossible to hide completely. He attended fewer political dinners in London, returned to Greyhaven earlier than expected after business meetings, allowed fires to burn late into the night again instead of retreating alone to cold rooms wrapped in silence. Most dangerously of all, he looked at Evelyn Whitmore as though he had forgotten how not to. The servants noticed first, then the neighboring estates. Finally, society itself. Evelyn understood the danger long before Lucien did. It revealed itself quietly one snowy afternoon while she sat beside Lady Agnes in the drawing room, sorting through old letters near the fire. A servant entered carrying the latest London papers upon a silver tray. "Your afternoon post, my lady." Lady Agnes accepted the stack absently before one folded newspaper slipped free onto the carpet near Evelyn's feet. A headline immediately caught her eye. "The ruined beauty of Whitmore House captivates Greyhaven's widowed Duke. Her blood turned cold." Lady Agnes noticed instantly. "What is it?" Evelyn reached for the paper too late. The older woman had already begun reading. Silence settled heavily across the room as her expression hardened with every line. Finally, she lowered the newspaper slowly onto her lap. "Vultures," she muttered quietly. Evelyn took the paper from her trembling hands and forced herself to continue reading despite the nausea tightening painfully in her chest. The article described her as an ambitious fallen lady who had strategically secured residence at Greyhaven Manor after losing her fortune and engagement. It implied she had manipulated Lucian's sympathy to elevate herself back into society through seduction and calculated vulnerability. Worst of all, Theodore Ashcombe himself had apparently spoken privately to reporters in London. Evelyn could hardly breathe by the time she finished. "I never said any of those things," she whispered faintly. Lady Agnes reached for her hand immediately. "Of course you did not." But Evelyn barely heard her. Every humiliation from the past months rushed back at once. The pitying stares, the ballroom whispers, the feeling of being watched not as a person but as scandal waiting to happen. And now Lucian would suffer because of her. His name dragged through gossip columns because he offered shelter to someone society already decided was ruined. The thought hurt more deeply than her own reputation ever had. Later that evening, snow fell heavily beyond the library windows while Lucian reviewed correspondence beside the fire. Evelyn stood silently near the doorway holding the newspaper folded tightly in trembling hands. He looked up immediately upon seeing her face. "What happened?" She crossed the room, slowly before placing the article onto his desk without speaking. Lucian read the headline once. Only once. Then something dark settled instantly behind his eyes. Not shock. Fury. Cold and controlled and dangerous enough to quiet the entire room. "Who wrote this?" he asked quietly. Evelyn shook her head faintly. "It does not matter. It matters to me." His voice sharpened for the first time since she arrived at Greyhaven. Evelyn lowered her gaze quickly. "This will damage you." Lucian stood slowly from behind the desk. "I could not care less about gossip. But I do." The words escaped more painfully than intended. Silence followed immediately. Evelyn forced herself to continue despite the ache tightening in her throat. "You gave me shelter when I had nowhere left to go. You treated me with dignity when everyone else saw humiliation. And now your name is attached to scandal because of me." Lucian stared at her across the firelit room. "Evelyn, I should leave Greyhaven." The words shattered something invisible between them. Lucian's expression changed instantly. Not anger. Something far more raw. "No." The single word echoed sharply through the library. Evelyn looked up in surprise. He moved around the desk slowly until only a few feet separated them now. Candlelight flickered across his face while snow brushed softly against the dark windows behind him. "You think I would allow strangers and newspapers to decide who remains in this house?" His voice lowered dangerously. "I have buried a wife, buried a child, buried half my life beside them. Do you truly believe gossip frightens me?" Evelyn's chest tightened painfully at the intensity in his eyes. "Lucian." "No." He stepped closer still. "Look at me." Slowly she obeyed. And for the first time since arriving at Greyhaven Manor, Evelyn saw the full, terrifying truth beneath his calm restraint. Lucian Ravenscroft was not merely protecting her anymore. He was already far too emotionally lost to let her go. The snowfall grew heavier over Greyhaven Manor after the article appeared in London society papers. For 3 days, the estate remained wrapped in a silence so tense even the servants spoke in hushed voices. Behind closed doors, Evelyn avoided the library entirely. She took her meals privately with Lady Agnes, spent long afternoons reading beside the older woman's fire, and retreated upstairs before evening whenever Lucian returned from meetings or correspondence. It was cowardly. She knew that. But every time she remembered the look in his eyes when he told her to stay, something inside her weakened in ways she could no longer safely ignore. Because the truth frightened her now more than scandal ever could. She had begun needing him too. On the 4th evening, another storm arrived from the northern coast. Wind screamed against the cliffs surrounding Greyhaven, while snow buried the roads leading toward town beneath nearly 2 feet of ice and drifting frost. Most of the household gathered early around fireplaces while servants secured shutters against the weather. Evelyn sat alone in her bedroom near midnight with her traveling case open upon the bed. Candlelight flickered softly across folded dresses and carefully stacked books while snow rattled against the dark windows. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed. Not from uncertainty, from grief. She paused often simply to breathe through the ache tightening in her chest. Leaving felt unbearable. Staying felt impossible. If she remained, society would destroy Lucien piece by piece until his name became another source of amusement whispered through London drawing rooms. And worst of all, she feared the dangerous tenderness growing between them far more than gossip itself. The Duke had already lost too much. She refused to become another wound attached to her name. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Greyhaven Manor slept beneath darkness and stormlight. Evelyn moved quietly through the corridors wearing her thick wool coat, with it drawn tightly against the cold. One servant had agreed reluctantly to prepare a small carriage for Dawn under the assumption she intended to visit the nearby village for charity work. No one else knew she planned never to return. As she descended the grand staircase for the last time, Evelyn stopped briefly beside the enormous window overlooking the frozen grounds below. Snow drifted endlessly through silver moonlight while candle flames trembled against the marble walls behind her. This house had once felt like a tomb. Somehow it had become the closest thing to home she possessed left in the world. The realization nearly broke her resolve. She lowered her eyes quickly and continued toward the entrance hall. But the moment she reached the front doors, a familiar voice stopped her cold. "Where are you going?" Lucien stood at the far end of the hall, partially hidden in shadow beside the library doorway, dressed only in dark trousers and a white shirt with sleeves rolled carelessly to his forearms, as though he had abandoned sleep hours earlier. Firelight flickered across his face while exhaustion darkened his gray eyes instantly upon seeing the traveling case in her hand. Evelyn's pulse faltered painfully. "I did not wish to wake anyone." His expression hardened at once. "That is not an answer." Snow battered the windows violently while silence stretched between them. Evelyn forced herself to speak steadily despite the pressure tightening in her throat. "I cannot stay here any longer." Lucien crossed the hall slowly toward her. "Because of gossip? Because of what it is doing to you. You do not decide what matters to me." His voice remained calm, but anger lived beneath every word now. Evelyn shook her head faintly. "You offered me kindness when I had nowhere else to go. I will not repay that kindness by becoming a scandal attached to your name forever." Lucien stopped only inches away, close enough now that she could see exhaustion etched deeply beneath his controlled expression. "Do you truly believe I care what society says about you?" Evelyn looked away immediately because she could no longer survive the intensity in his eyes. "This is not only about society." Silence followed. Dangerous silence. Then Lucien's voice lowered almost to a whisper. "Then tell me the truth." Her breath caught softly. He stepped closer still. "Tell me why you are really leaving." Evelyn's fingers tightened painfully around the handle of her traveling case. Because staying meant admitting something she no longer knew how to survive denying. The way his presence steadied her breathing. The way silence no longer felt lonely when he entered a room. The way she had begun listening for his footsteps in the hall without realizing it. Tears finally burned behind her eyes for the first time in months. "Because I cannot lose another home," she whispered brokenly. Something inside Lucien shattered quietly at those words. He reached for her then, without hesitation, one hand closing firmly around the handle of the traveling case before she could pull away. "Evelyn." His voice carried no coldness now, only raw, desperate honesty. "You are not leaving Greyhaven tonight." The storm raged harder beyond Greyhaven Manor, as though winter itself refused to let the night end quietly. Snow struck the towering windows in furious waves while candlelight trembled across the entrance hall where Evelyn stood frozen beneath Lucien Ravenscroft's gaze. His hand remained wrapped firmly around the handle of her traveling case, refusing to release it despite the silence stretching painfully between them. Neither moved. Neither breathed properly. Somewhere upstairs, the old grandfather clock echoed 2 slow chimes through the sleeping manor. Evelyn lowered her eyes first because she could no longer endure the rawness in his expression without breaking completely. Please, she whispered weakly. Do not make this harder. Lucien stepped closer immediately. Harder. His voice carried quiet disbelief now. You intend to disappear from this house before sunrise, and you believe the difficult part belongs to you alone? Evelyn's throat tightened painfully. You deserve peace. A bitter shadow crossed his face. Peace left Greyhaven 5 years ago. The words settled heavily between them while snow and wind battered the world outside. Evelyn looked at him slowly then. Truly looked at him. At the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior. At the grief he carried so carefully every day as though surviving itself had become an obligation rather than a choice. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing only the feared widowed Duke society whispered about. She saw the lonely man standing awake in dark libraries after midnight because sleep no longer brought comfort. The man who lit fireplaces before she entered cold rooms. The man who listened when she spoke as though her thoughts still mattered despite everything the world stripped from her. And suddenly leaving him felt less like survival and more like betrayal. Tears burned fiercely behind her eyes. I cannot survive watching them destroy you because of me, she admitted softly. Lucien's expression changed instantly at the sound of her voice breaking. Every trace of anger disappeared beneath something infinitely more dangerous. Tenderness. He released the traveling case slowly before lifting one hand toward her face with visible hesitation, as though uncertain whether he still remembered how gentleness worked after years without it. His fingers brushed lightly beneath her chin, guiding her eyes back toward him. Evelyn, he said quietly, look at me. She obeyed despite trembling. Candlelight flickered between them while shadows moved softly across the marble walls behind his broad shoulders. Lucien's gray eyes searched hers with an honesty so unguarded it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. You keep trying to leave before anyone has the chance to choose you willingly. Her chest tightened painfully. Lucien. No, his voice lowered almost to a whisper. Listen to me now. Snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows while silence wrapped around them like another living thing. You believe surviving alone makes you less likely to be abandoned, he continued gently. But loneliness is not safety, Evelyn. I know that better than anyone. A tear slipped silently down her cheek before she could stop it. Lucien brushed it away carefully with his thumb, his touch impossibly warm against skin gone cold from fear and heartbreak and months of carrying pain too quietly. When Catherine died, he said softly, I convinced myself love only existed to leave eventually. So I buried everything with her. The music, the laughter, every part of myself capable of feeling anything deeply enough to hurt again. His hand trembled faintly against her face now, but he did not pull away. Then you walked into Greyhaven carrying your own grief, like something fragile you refused to let destroy anyone else. Evelyn's breathing faltered completely. And somehow, Lucien whispered, you made this house feel alive again. The words shattered the final walls around her heart. She looked away instantly as another tear escaped despite every effort to remain composed. I am afraid, she admitted brokenly. Lucien moved closer until barely inches separated them now. So am I. The confession hung between them in stunned silence. A powerful duke admitting fear as though it cost him nothing compared to losing her. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, overwhelmed by the aching sincerity in his voice. Then slowly, carefully, Lucien rested his forehead lightly against hers. No urgency, no possession, only closeness offered like trust itself. You are not alone anymore, he murmured quietly. And I am not letting you disappear from my life because frightened people enjoy gossip. Evelyn's fingers slowly tightened against the front of his coat as though her body had finally surrendered to the truth before her mind could resist it any longer. Outside, winter storms consumed the cliffs surrounding Greyhaven Manor. But inside the silence between them no longer felt cold. Spring arrived slowly at Greyhaven Manor. Snow melted from the cliffs in silver streams, while pale sunlight returned to windows that had spent years hidden beneath winter shadows. The change touched the estate quietly at first. Servants opened curtains earlier in the mornings. Fresh flowers appeared beside fireplaces once left cold and forgotten. Piano music drifted occasionally through the halls again, soft and hesitant, like a memory relearning how to breathe. Yet the greatest change remained impossible to ignore. Lucien Ravenscroft smiled now. Not often, not easily. but enough for the household to notice the impossible had somehow happened within the old manor walls. Evelyn stood near the greenhouse garden one mild April afternoon with Lady Agnes's shawl folded over her arm, while cool wind stirred gently through the roses beginning to bloom along the stone pathways. Weeks had passed since the night Lucian stopped her from leaving, and nothing between them had returned to what it once was. Because silence itself had changed. It no longer felt lonely when they shared it together. Some evenings they sat beside the library fire reading separate books, while rain touched the windows softly beyond them. Other nights Lucian played piano after dinner, while Evelyn listened quietly near the hearth, watching the shadows leave his face little by little with every passing song. Neither rushed what existed between them. Neither needed to. Some loves did not arrive like lightning. They arrived like winter ending after years of cold. "You are smiling again," Lady Agnes observed warmly beside her now. Evelyn looked down almost shyly. "Am I?" "Quite often lately." The older woman's eyes softened knowingly. "It suits you better than sorrow." Before Evelyn could answer, footsteps approached behind them across the stone path. She turned instinctively. Lucian. He wore a dark coat despite the warming weather, one hand tucked loosely behind his back, while sunlight touched the silver strands beginning to appear near his temples. Even now, he still carried traces of grief within him. Evelyn suspected he always would. But grief no longer looked like the only thing keeping him alive. His gaze found hers immediately. Always hers first now. "Lady Agnes," he greeted with a slight nod. "Dr. Whitmore requested you avoid the afternoon wind." The older woman rolled her eyes dramatically. "Your concern becomes more insufferable every year." Lucian almost smiled. Almost. Then his attention returned quietly toward Evelyn. "May I borrow Miss Whitmore for a moment?" Lady Agnes glanced between them with visible amusement before accepting her shawl. "Do not keep her standing too long. Spring evenings remain cold in the north." Once the older woman disappeared back toward the manor, silence settled softly between them beneath the pale afternoon sky. Lucian stepped closer slowly until only a few feet separated them beside the blooming garden paths. "You have been avoiding me today," he said quietly. Evelyn looked down briefly. "I was not aware you noticed." "I notice everything concerning you." Her breath caught faintly at the honesty in his voice. Wind moved gently through the gardens while distant bells echoed from the nearby village below the cliffs. Lucian studied her face for several moments before finally revealing the small object hidden behind his back. A single white rose. Freshly cut. Evelyn stared at it in surprise. "The greenhouse finally bloomed again this morning," he explained softly. "It has not happened this early since Catherine died." The confession carried no pain now, only memory, and somehow that mattered more. Lucian held the rose toward her carefully, almost uncertain despite everything they had already survived together. "I thought perhaps Greyhaven deserved something beautiful growing inside it again." Evelyn accepted the flower slowly, her fingers brushing his for only a second. Yet even that small touch still carried enough tenderness to quiet the world around them. She looked up at him then, sunlight warming her face while spring wind moved softly through her hair. "You already brought life back to this house," she whispered. Lucian's expression changed at once. Something deep and unguarded moved through his gray eyes before he stepped closer still, lifting one hand carefully against her cheek with the same reverence he once reserved only for fragile things he feared losing. "No," he murmured quietly. "You did." For several seconds neither spoke. They simply stood there together beneath the warming sky, while Greyhaven Manor rose behind them no longer like a mausoleum, but like a home learning how to live again. And somewhere within the silence surrounding them, two wounded hearts finally understood the same truth. Love had not arrived to erase their pain. It arrived because they survived it.